Or self-consciousness has not yet attained this happy state of being the ethical substance, the spirit of a people. For having turned back from its role of observer, spirit at first is not yet as such realized through itself. It is established only as an inner essence or as an abstraction. In other words, spirit is at first immediate, but existing immediately it is separate and individual. It is the practical consciousness which steps into its world which it finds already given, with the aim of duplicating itself in this distinct form of something separate and individual, of producing itself as this individual, as this existent counterpart of itself, and of becoming conscious of this unity of its own actuality with the objective being of the world. Self-consciousness has the certainty of this unity. It holds that the unity is implicitly already present, or that this agreement of itself with thinghood already exists and has only to become so for it through its own agency, or that the production of that unity is equally the finding of it. Since this unity means happiness, the individual is sent out into the world by his own spirit to seek his happiness. You'll notice that paragraph 356 begins and ends with the same major consideration, that of happiness. And Hegel is going to be charting out not an ethics, but the dialectical development and successes and failures of a number of different positions in ethics, or if you prefer, different kinds of morality, lived moral theory, although he will make a distinction between ethics and morality, as we'll see. Happiness is the term that's coming up here at the very beginning of this in terms of the happy state, glückliche, right, condition or state that was talked about in the last paragraph. And it's going to end with Hegel invoking happiness as what it is that is fundamentally driving, what is fundamentally drawing the self-consciousness, the subject, the human being on. And you might be tempted to read into this, if you know something about moral theory, various forms of what we call eudaimonism, which is moral theories that center themselves around conceptions of happiness. So this would include such moral theories as those of ancient virtue ethicists like Plato and Aristotle. Some people consider the Stoics to be eudaimonists of a certain type, although I think there's a good argument against considering them to be fundamentally that way. The Epicurean hedonist tradition definitely fits into that as well. And many of the conceptions that we have in modernity, some of which Hegel is going to chart out and examine. It's not as if they don't exist in ancient and medieval times at all, but they assume a certain prominence in modernity, like this law of the heart that he's going to chart out. Those all have to do with this conception of happiness as well. So it might be tempting to read into this something like, Aristotle saying, well, everybody really desires happiness, or Thomas Aquinas saying that, but that we misconceive, most of us, what the nature or the guise or the shape of happiness truly is. So some of us think it to be physical pleasure, and others think it to be honor or social status or something along those lines, when we'd really understand and say it's virtuous activity or contemplation or being with God or whatever. And what Hegel is driving at here is some of what gets left out in those thumbnail sketches of Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas, because that's not their full position either. Happiness would be the full realization of the human being as human being. And so that requires us to think out and think about what that realization would be, generally from a standpoint where we don't actually enjoy that realization. So all of that said by way of preface, Hegel says the self-consciousness has not attained this happy state of being the ethical substance, the spirit of a people. Why? Because having turned back from its role of observer, spirit, at first, the role of observer was in the previous entire section. Spirit, at first, is not yet as such realized through itself. It hasn't fully come to terms with it. That's to be expected. We're in the process of a development here, right? So what has it done? He says it's established only as an inner essence or as an abstraction. So we got to this point in the previous paragraphs where the ethical substance was being seen, the substance being the mores, the entire life of a people, a folk, a community, was seen as being abstract and, in a certain sense, content-full, but also content-less. It didn't have essence to it anymore. So he says, in other words, spirit is immediate, but existing immediately, it is separate and individual. Now, does this mean that there's only one individual? No. There's a number of individuals that spirit is now diversifying itself, we might say, into. Almost as if when we talk about, if you're a smart investor, you diversify your portfolio. You don't put all your proverbial eggs into one basket. Spirit is becoming all of these individuals who themselves are part of the larger framework of society, but also have the possibility of being able to truly see themselves as individuals. Insofar as they do, they wind up being estranged from that ethical substance that we talked about and needing to find themselves. That's what he's talking about here. So he says it's the praktische consciousness which steps into the world, or takes a step, eintreten, into the world which is already given, as he says, or rather the world as practical consciousness finds it, vorgefundene, right? The world that it's finding, the world that's there for it. And that's a world that's already got all sorts of history and, various hierarchies of status and perhaps oppositions. It's stepping into a world that is concrete, not merely abstract. And what happens then? Now here's where it gets really, really interesting. Hegel says it has the aim of duplicating itself in this distinct form of something separate and individual. Now, what does that mean? So to begin with, this duplicating, verdoppeln, right? Zu verdoppeln, that's what the German actually reads. So it steps into this world for that purpose of duplicating itself. Now, why does it have to duplicate itself? It's already in the world. It already exists. Well, in order for it to be able to understand itself, in order for it to be able to grasp itself, it has to duplicate itself. This doesn't mean that it creates a clone or that it's staring in the mirror all the time. Another way of thinking about this is it is searching for its identity in no longer in, what's my social status or something like that, something that's merely given to it, but in something that it itself produces through its own activity. Now this activity could be enjoyment, as it's going to be with pleasure. It could be in action itself, as in the law of the heart coming up, or in the quest for virtue. It could be in a number of other things, including in recognizing and respecting others. All of these are possibilities for the individual spirit that is attempting, or the individual mind that is duplicating itself as a truly separate individual. So he goes on and he says some really interesting things here. He says, it has to take on this distinct form of something separate, an individual producing itself as this individual, as this existent counterpart of itself. And of becoming conscious of this unity of its own actuality with the objective being of the world. So practical consciousness is aiming at a unity in duplicating itself It's not duplicating itself so that it can create another itself, which would go off and maybe do all the housework, or do the boring taxes, or go take the stupid classes, or whatever. It's duplicating itself in the world, in how it can see itself, and it remains a unity with itself even in that duplication. So he says self-consciousness has the certainty of this unity. And this is a unity not only with itself, with what it has created of itself, but also with the world to a certain extent. The way Hegel's talking about it here. So he goes on and he says, self-consciousness has the certainty of this unity. It holds that the unity is implicitly already present, or this agreement of itself with thinghood, being able to objectify itself, being able to say, I am this guy who chalks up the chalkboard, right, for example, already exists. This agreement already exists, and has only to become so for it through its own agency. I know who I am. I'll write it on the chalkboard. I'll show you. I'll show myself. In showing you, I show myself what I am. In this case, a man explaining Hegel, because that's part of his identity as the practical conscious. We use that as an example, right? The guy who puts on a tie a certain way, right? So he goes on and he says, the production of that unity is equally the finding of it. Now this unity means happiness. Here's where it gets very interesting, and also harkens back to, if not Aristotle, certainly Aquinas and other thinkers, where what makes us truly happy is not just a sort of fulfillment of ourselves, but this sense of finding what is truly appropriate to us, what we really are. That's this unity that isn't just a mere fusion, but is an identity in difference, or a commonality, a sharing, a communion. So Hegel goes on and he says, since this unity means happiness, the individual is sent out into the world by his own spirit, by his own Geist, to seek his own happiness. Now notice what that last line is saying. This is not yet a possession, happiness. This is what is desired. This is what we're seeking. This is the Zweck, the end, that he's going to talk about in so many of the paragraphs yet to come. If then, for us, the truth of this rational self-consciousness is the ethical substance, here, for that self-consciousness, it is the beginning of its ethical experience of the world. Insofar as it has not yet become the ethical substance, this movement presses forward to it, and what is superseded in the movement are the individual moments which for self-consciousness are valid in their isolation. They have the form of an immediate will or natural impulse which obtains its satisfaction, which is itself the content of a fresh impulse. If, however, self-consciousness has lost the happiness of being in the substance, these natural impulses are bound up with an awareness that their goal is the true character and essential nature of self-consciousness. The ethical substance has sunk to the level of a predicate devoid of self, whose living subjects are individuals who themselves have to provide the filling for their universality and to fulfill their essential nature through their own efforts. Taken in the former sense, then, those forms are the coming to be of the ethical substance and precede it. In the latter, they succeed it and reveal to self-consciousness what its ethical nature is. In the former case, the immediacy or rawness of the impulses gets lost in the process of getting to know what their truth is, and their content takes on a higher form. In the latter case, what is lost is the false idea of the consciousness, which places its essential nature in those impulses. In the former case, the goal they attain is the ethical substance, while in the latter it is the consciousness of that substance, a consciousness which knows the substance to be its own essence. And to that extent, this process would be the coming into existence of morality of a higher form than the ethical substance. But these forms at the same time constitute only one side of morality's entry into existence, that namely which belongs to being for self, or in which consciousness sets aside its ends, not the side where morality arises from the ethical substance itself. Since these moments cannot as yet carry the significance of being made into ends opposed to the lost ethical order, they signify here, it is true, no more than what they immediately are, and the goal which they strive to attain is the ethical substance. But since in our own times that form of these moments is more familiar, in which they appear after consciousness has lost its ethical life, and in the search for it repeats these forms, they may be represented more in terms of this sort. Running throughout paragraph 357 are a number of distinctions, or if you like, dichotomies of perspective, where Hegel is going to play one thing off of another thing as two different ways of looking at the same matter that are fundamentally different from each other. There's an antithesis there that he's sketching out. And the first one is between the viewpoint for us, right? Thus the observer, the person who's following along in the phenomenology, who has some idea of where they're going and some remembrance of where we've been. For us, he says, the truth of rational self-consciousness is the ethical substance. We've already discussed that. But that's not the case for the self-consciousness. He says for that self-consciousness, the one that we're observing, the one that we're following out its narrative and its progression and its development, he says it is the beginning of its ethical experience of the world. It's a very interesting thing to say, particularly given where we're going in the next, 3 sub-chapters. I'm not sure exactly how many paragraphs we have in there. These are not particularly long sub-chapters, but we're looking at about another, here we go, up to 393. So we're talking about another 40 paragraphs or so, give or take. All of that is going to be charting out this ethical experience of the world, this growing in understanding its own ethical position, its own successes, and its own failures. So, let's follow along. He says, insofar as it has not yet become the ethical substance, right, which is what it's driving for, although there's going to be a little twist along the way, as we're going to see. Insofar as it has not yet become the ethical substance, this movement presses forward to that. It's something that we are desiring. This ethical substance is, you might say, the lost object that we're continually searching for. Once we've left that happy state of innocence, we want to bring things back together again and be good again, be right again, and that's what we're seeking for, and that's what the individual consciousness is seeking for in its own development through these dialectics. So he says, what is superseded, what is aufgehoben in the movement are the individual moments which for self-consciousness are valid in their isolation. So we start out with these individual moments, so we could put a whole plurality of them there. What is he talking about? An individual consciousness, a person, a human being. So he says they have the form of an immediate will, an unmediated, unmittelbar. And here the word for will in this case is not wille, it's wollen. This is the verb. It's a willing, a volitioning, you might say. Or a natural impulse, a Naturtrieb, right? Trieb just means like a drive. Like when we talk about somebody having drives that are impelling them towards something, right? That's a trieb. And Hegel says there's two things going on here. He says, on the one hand, these natural impulses are trying to obtain their satisfaction. We have these drives, or this willing, this choosing, this doing, and it wants satisfaction. So think, for example, about when you're a kid and you get some candy, and candy's sweet, and when you're a kid, sweetness is pretty great, isn't it? And you want some more candy. Here in the States, we have Halloween, and as I'm shooting this, that's coming up later this month. I think back to when I was a kid and going around trick-or-treating. There was all the fun and the pageantry and costumes, and you'd get to eat a little bit of candy along the way, and there'd be all the doing things. And then you get home and you pour all that candy out of your bag or your pumpkin or whatever else you were collecting it in, maybe a pillowcase. And then you start looking at the candy, and then you start gobbling it up, right? And your parents would say, oh, you can't eat it all tonight, but you'd probably do quite a good job in, as we say, putting a hurt on that pile of candy. Why? Well, because you have a trieb. You have a natural impulse to cram your mouth full of sweet stuff. Now, what happens when you do that satisfying thing? The satisfaction wears off. Right? And you get a bit older, you discover sexuality, same sort of progression, right? There's a lot of pleasure to be had in sexuality for a little while, and then, it leaves wanting to do some more back in its place. And we can say the same thing with desire after desire after desire, right? And people sometimes get caught up in that, this endless progression. I mean, that's what happens in drug addiction, but also in other forms of, desire that turns into kind of an endless cycle. So Hegel says that this is something that we do have happen. We have this natural impulse that obtains its satisfaction, and then its satisfaction provides the content of a fresh impulse. Now, what he says after that is there's another possibility. If, however, self-consciousness has lost the happiness of being in the substance, the happiness, the Glück, the enjoyment of being in the ethical substance, of knowing where you fit in to your society with its norms and its laws and your proper place, right? If it's lost this happiness, these natural impulses are bound up with an awareness that their goal is the true character and essential nature of self-consciousness. Now, this is interesting. Could it just be that sometimes people mistake this as, well, the true nature and essential nature of self-consciousness is just to get off or to cram your face full of candy as often as you can, or to make a ton of money and die with it at the end. It's even, sort of a sadder idea of happiness. But really what it is it's something that lies beyond mere satisfaction, right? There's a goal, a Zweck. Hegel, by the way, in this passage, Miller is translating Zweck in two different ways. Goal is one way that you can translate it, makes perfect sense. Another way that he's translating it is with the word end. And, when we talk about making something into an end, deciding on that, that's really synonymous with goal. So don't get too caught up on the distinction of language there, because it's really not a distinction in the German. So he goes on and he says, the ethical substance has sunk to the level of a predicate devoid of self, whose living subjects are individuals, which themselves have to provide the filling for their universality. They have to decide what counts as the universal for themselves in the course of their own experience. It may be that pleasure, as we're going to see in the first dialectic, is what we strive for. Or it might be a sort of satisfaction in oneself as a good person. Not something ethics talks an awful lot about, but Hegel realizes how important, how driving that is for us human beings. Or perhaps it's in some transcendent conception of virtue, transcendent to our own individuality, at least. So he goes on and he says they have to fulfill their essential nature through their own efforts. And then now here come a lot of dichotomies. Taken in the former sense, those forms are the coming to be of the ethical substance and precede it. Right? The forms precede ethical substance. In the latter, they succeed it and reveal to self-consciousness what its essential nature is. So there's two sides that we can look at here. He says, again, in the former case, the immediacy or rawness of the impulses gets lost in the process of getting to know what their truth is, and their content takes a higher form. This is a bit more important. When we're following out something that we think is going to make us happy, that is going to be our goal, when we're looking at it carefully, we start to learn more about it, but we lose that immediacy of the charge that it gives us, right? That's good. We're learning more about ourselves in the process. I figure out, something about the sweetness that I enjoy eating, and I figure out that it's not just that, but there's something else going on there. And now I'm no longer quite attending to the sensuousness of the sweetness, and I'm paying more attention to the whole process. I can then raise it to a higher level. He goes on and he says, in the latter case, what is lost is the false idea of the consciousness which places its essential nature in those impulses. Again, in the former case, the goal they attain is the ethical substance. That's what we're driving at. In the latter, it's the consciousness of that substance, a consciousness which knows the substance to be its own essence. There's this reconciliation of what has been alienated, the individual, from the ethical substance. And, he says, to the extent this process would be the coming into existence of a morality, a Moralität in German, something that is a higher state of existence or a higher Gestalt than mere ethical substance, mere following what the people do in your country, right? Merely replicating the norms within yourself and then transmitting them to others. Once we begin thinking about what we ought to do, what's good and what's bad, what's right and what's wrong, what's better and what's worse, we start to step onto the path of morality, of something that is more self-conscious, something that's more of our nature. Now, Hegel doesn't want to split these apart forever. He says that morality would be a higher form than the ethical substance, and he says, but these forms at the same time constitute only one side of morality's entry into existence, that namely which belongs to being for self, the consciousness, or in which consciousness sets aside its ends, its original goals, its original Zwecke that are being provided to it by the ethical substance, right? It sets aside its ends, not the side where morality arises from the ethical substance itself. Morality and ethical substance, or the ethical, the Sittliche, are not necessarily opposed to each other, but they often are at certain moments in history and for certain individuals. So he goes on and he says, since these moments at this point in development cannot as yet carry the significance of being made into ends opposed to the lost ethical order. Notice, you can't get this, and you also can't get this. Not yet, not at this point. That's what we're about to try to do in these dialectics. He says, since you don't have either of these, they signify here no more than what they immediately are. And the goal which they strive to attain is the ethical substance. But since in our times that form of these moments is more familiar, in which they appear after consciousness has lost its ethical life and in the search for it repeats these forms, they may be represented more in terms of this sort. Now, what are the terms of this sort? Well, we're about to get to these. These are going to be these three dialectical movements that Hegel is essentially prioritizing. And he's doing that from the standpoint of people who, in the modern era, have become estranged from their ethical substance, from their, what was being provided to them by the life of their people, their nation, their folk. So that's going to be described in the next 30-odd paragraphs to come, but also in the next two paragraphs that are rounding out this introductory section.